Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I will have a conversation with my great friend Tren. Hello, Tren.
Hi everyone, this is Chen. I'm cultural historian of medieval Europe and China. Great to be with you all today.
Today, we're going to continue our conversation on John Odling Smee's book, Niche Construction. And in the first episode, after our introduction to the project itself, we talked about the standard evolutionary theory. And the standard evolutionary theory basically consists of the modern synthesis, the synthesis between Darwinian natural selection and genetic inheritance. And we discussed that from the standard evolutionary theory's perspective, ultimately what matters in evolution of life is genetic inheritance and natural selection of genetic combinations is the only directing adaptive force in evolution of populations. And for those reasons, the emphasis on the environment or agency of organisms or anything resembling that, alongside with any emphasis on inheritance systems beyond genetic inheritance, is irrelevant to the task of understanding evolution of life. And we mentioned that this irrelevance does not translate to insignificance for other purposes of all of these mentioned points. It just means that for evolution, insofar as evolution of life is concerned, those uh, parallel inheritance systems or something like niche construction, changing of the environment through like agent-like behavior of organisms do not matter. John Odling, Smee, is challenging that conclusion in niche construction and challenging SET from Odling Smee's perspective does not equal rejecting the legitimacy of the modern synthesis. It only points at an important incompleteness in how standard evolutionary theory wants to understand life and its evolution. And in this session of our conversation, we are gonna go to the basics because that's exactly what Alding's does. We're gonna go to the basic concepts of life and information and the relationship that both have with energy because as you're going to see, Aldous Smith's point is ultimately that the standard evolutionary theory does not give a proper image of what it takes to be a living being and what it takes for a living being to evolve. So that's going to be the rhythm of the day. Trent, anything to add?
Now let's just proceed. This is very
Mm-hmm.
helpful scaffolding where we left a little behind last time.
All right, great. So the one of the interesting things that we will see in the niche construction book is that, as Trent mentioned in a prior episode, the you we see a wide range of like disciplines getting involved in the analysis. And the book starts not from biology or ecology, but from physics. And that's something very important because, as I mentioned before, the major idea that I think the author has is that we need to go back to the basic, like the core of it means to be a living being to really adjudicate whether the standard evolutionary theory is a sufficient explanation of what it means for life to exist or at least evolve. And the way that Odling Smee deals with the concept of life takes its origins in Erwin Schrödinger. And the basic idea there, or basic kind of tension to address, is something about order, a very specific type of order. And the core issue is the second law of thermodynamics. Uh, Odling and Smee talks about Maxwell's demon and other layers of um, uh, the, the the topic there. We're not gonna touch upon those much, but the core remains the same. The idea of the second law of thermodynamics is that the entropy, measure of disorder for lack of better terms, of isolated systems left to spontaneous evolution cannot decrease, as they always tend towards a state of thermodynamic equilibrium where the entropy is highest at the given internal energy. A very classic, kind of easy to like remember image is like when you put a drop of ink in water, the spontaneous evolution of that ink in that water is to dissipate. It's not that you put the ink there and just stays there. It always goes towards in a stage that is no, that kind of asymmetry doesn't exist to the maximum way that like the ink droplets or molecules that constitute uh, the ink are going to be distributed as equally as possible within that data space. Of course, different chemicals, different reactions, different time, but like insofar as the spontaneous action, chemical action of atoms go, that's the direction. So whenever you have an ordered system, you have a far from equilibrium system, an asymmetric system that is not re rejecting the second law, but is locally kind of like pushing it to a point of like not happening immediately, right? Basically, you can postpone that dissipation. You can postpone the dominance of the disorder. You can have moments of order. And of course, this moments of order is not just about you know, human beings, like having some ordered structure, but even like snowflakes or like stones or planets or things of that nature. The idea is not that the order never exists. The idea is that order is always unstable. Thermodynamic, in a thermodynamic sense, is always unstable. And once there is an opening, it's going to go through a higher entropy um, state. Any isolated system ultimately goes towards a more disordered state in the sense of like kind of dissipating into it, whatever surrounds it. Now, how is it related to life? Well, life is a low entropy, open, far from equilibrium, locally complex system that adheres to the second law of thermodynamics by constantly exporting disorder, heat, and waste to its surrounding and consuming high quality energy. Okay, so let's just unpack a number of things there so that we can meaningfully discuss what comes next. So life is not rejecting the second law of thermodynamics, but life is a locally complex and ordered system, which is different from an ink that dissipates in water. Not because like we are not gonna like life also dissolves. That's called death. But as life, as it maintains a living organism, maintains its identity as a living organism, there is this far from equilibrium state in the thermodynamic sense and low entropy. state that is sustained from one moment to the other. And this is also just related to the kind of circle of energy that exists. There is like added disorder by the detritus, heat and waste, and all of these other things, um, so that the order within the system remains in place. So if a living organism doesn't have any way to kind of have a moment of dissipation, I'm guessing that it's going to be unsustainable. It kind of explodes. Um, if there's no heat going out, if there's no energy going out, there's no way for it to maintain that far from equilibrium status. And of course, for the whole system to work, energy needs to be, there not, must be an intake of energy. In other words, it takes energy to maintain a system far from equilibrium. And you can think about that in the case of the ink droplet as well. If we want to keep the ink just hyper localized within that, like, bottle of water, we need to spend energy to maintain that. And that energy for a droplet of ink will be very different from maintaining an energy for bacteria, and that will be very different from like an earthworm or like an ape, but the same logic exists. Okay. So life that then gets into the position of being evolved, or being like thrown into like this kind of evolutionary logic, is more than anything else is a far from equilibrium system in thermodynamic senses, in thermodynamic sense, that is exporting disorder, just kind of like putting that kind of needed creation of disorder outside of itself, and consumes energy to maintain its far from equilibrium status. This is, of course, not the most sophisticated physical and like formulaic explanation of the law of thermodynamics, second law of thermodynamics, or life, but I think it does the job to kind of give us a picture of what we're looking for, or what we're looking at, or what it takes to keep being alive. Trent?
Yes, 3 points that kind of a 3 points of inspiration I received while listening to your exposition. First is kind of to echo what you said. Here we see a really interesting switch of attention introduced by Odling and Smee. So unlike the standard evolutionary theorist that he maintains, to understand how life evolves, which is one big question for uh, SET, we must also consider another question which kind of predates or at least accompanies the main question at all time is that how is life possible? So that's how he introduced the things that are previously not considered in the discussion into it. Second, I think his approach towards the sort of integration of different disciplines, so to speak, is very similar to what we discussed a few months ago about like that evolutionary psychologist sort of approach towards like perhaps the cultural anthropologies or whatever. In the sense that there is kind of a hierarchy of different approaches. For instance, when analyzing abiotic forms, what a lot of principles that we observe in life science that do not concern physicists or ecologists in their calculation of energy flow, something like that. However, when we're doing the other way, law of some fundamental laws, like a lot of energy, absolutely matters for the maintenance of life. So to understand how life evolves, we need to understand not only those principles unique to life science, but also those principles shared between life sciences and non-life sciences. So there is a hierarchy of like different analogy and principles there, which I think is the analogous to what we talked about a few months ago. And one final thing is to connect the beautiful imagery you very simple, elegant imagery about the ink droplet into a water and life, death. Say if I throw you into, say, Barton Spring, which is our favorite place in Austin, and you were there swimming for an hour, yet you as an entity in the life did not dissipate. However, if you are like you enter the water and you had hit a rock and you died, and I'll just leave you there, give you enough time, you will dissipate, and entropy and that of course is way more complicated to change mediation. A lot of other life forms that get involved, but ultimately is that part of you, the concentration of orderness within you at this moment, or when you are swimming, would gradually move towards the same level of orderliness or disorders as the whole swimming pool is exhibiting. So these are the 3 points that I thought of when you were like helping us to understand how at least me introduce like a lot of the second law of thermodynamics into the analysis of evolution of life.
Yes, I think that, and I think that's like to add to the really good parallel that you created. Like if you drop like a droplet of ink in Barton Springs dissipates immediately. Like it just disappears, just get mixed up. Um, a swimmer doesn't dissipate unless the membrane punctures, there's death, things of that nature. But it's also like interesting to kind of like have another view. Like it's if you know a, a box of potatoes also doesn't dissipate, right? Like, but what is going to be the difference between the two? And I think that kind of like the relationship between energy and information and life is going to be important, kind of making that distinction also um, meaningful. That what is the difference between life and just like a membrane that just has like a container and just like doesn't dissipate. It's a very, very strong, box, right?
Hmm.
That also doesn't dissipate. And I think the point about information and what is the difference between a box not dissipating and a human being not dissipating? I think that's going to be something that is important in this discussion. Now, okay, so if we are thinking about it this way, if we're thinking about life this way, Odling and Smee is basically telling us that we have implicitly talked about all the conditions of life. Now we just need to make that explicit. And as Trent mentioned, the point here is that if you want to really understand what ev- evolution of life means, you need to clarify what life itself means. And that's exactly what Odling and Smee is doing here. Okay, so organisms as improbable bodies, which I really like, Odling Smee calls that, basically need to address three issues, right? The major issue that the living entities have is bioenergetics, meaning that they somehow need to resist the second law at the local level by manipulating the flow of energy. Like there is if there is no orderly structure to what is the intake and what is the outtake, the energy will come in and it will like destroy the membrane and there won't be life, there won't be any organs, everything will just kind of explode. So for life to remain existing, to exist and remain existence, there has to be um, a specific type of flow of energy, um, intake and detritus. Okay. Now, the second point becomes very important. To manipulate the flow of energy and resist the second law, living entities need to know how to do that. And that's the bioinformatics of life. Right? It is very important to make something very clear at this moment, and this is not the first time this is going to happen because a lot of other concepts are going to get introduced, and all of them are going to be, in some ways, very close to this, which is when I mention the term knowledge, I do not want the image to be like, a scholar knowing about ancient Greece, like not that type of knowledge. This is a more tacit, basic know-how that it is not, even it does, you don't even need to think about like bacteria, or like some sort of a basic form of life. Even like thinking about how does your heart know to manipulate the flow of energy in and out of itself, right? The heart is not like doesn't have a brain of its own. It's not like a minded entity that has knowledge. It just like it functions in the way that it often, if not always, maintained the right type of flow of energy, right? That type of knowledge. Right? Which its own interesting layer that we're going to touch upon in these conversations, but probably is going to re-enter our later conversations as well. What do we mean by knowledge at this point? What is important to know is that you cannot just be there and the flow of energy just happens to be there. That probably in the origin of life story somehow these two things kind of matched up, which is another layer that Odling and Smee talks about. But in terms of like, a beaver surviving, this story cannot be just the beaver is just there and like, the energy is magically happening. A beaver that doesn't go ahead and manipulate its environment is going to lose the flow of energy and it's going to die, right? Here's another way to put it in a more evolutionary language. The living beings that have more relevant information to manipulating the flow of energy to resist the second law will survive, right? This is not some sort of a divine intervention that now suddenly you need to have information. Is that if if you happen to be an entity that could, in one way or another, manipulate the energy flow in your benefit so that you can postpone your demise and reproduce, which I will get to in a second, then you are going to be the one that is going to survive, as opposed to another organism that just by happenstance, there was a system of flow of energy that they give it some sort of an existence. Okay. And another thing that is gonna become important in our conversations to a degree is that knowledge as a specific type of information also requires energy. Like you need to spend energy to get knowledge, and better for you if that investment pays off, right? If you end up knowing something that doesn't help you manipulate the flow of energy to resist the second law, that is gone. That was useless. That was not doing the job, right? And this whole point about resisting the second law by manipulating the flow of energy and information as a form of competitive advantage in in that story gets, of course, related to the point about inheritance. Because there is one thing to be alive, there is another thing to keep life going, right? And there is a form of inheritance, which is like now you have a new, like, generation of life that inherits something from the past life. Okay. The point is that, again, the organisms that manage to transmit the information necessary for manipulating the energy flow so that at the local level they remain far from equilibrium thermodynamic systems are the ones that keep surviving. In other words, if an organism somehow managed to manipulate the flow of energy to survive, but its descendants, in the very broad sense of the word, like not asexually reproducing entities also included, if the descendants do not inherit the information, they are at a disadvantage as opposed to their competitors that might have the information, right? And one of the very, 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 very basic things that we can think about this here is like immune system. Um, Very basic like systems of combating the other entities in their environment that are gonna make you get destroyed, right? So if like this generation like has some sort of a information capacity like to differentiate between two things, and just by happenstance have that, if it can transmit that information to the next generation, that next generation has a competitive advantage over other organisms that do not have that information. Okay. Again, all of this is happening in a very kind of a crude way. Or let's put it like differently. This does not need to be about a sophisticated human version of this story at all, right? Last thing here, transmitting knowledge and information is also dependent on energy. So this whole like bioenergetics and bioinformatics of life, as it gets connected to the inheritance systems, it's all about manipulation of energy flows, creation, maintenance, and transmission of information needed for manipulating energy flows, and understanding that all this information, transmitted or otherwise, requires energy. Trent.
Yeah, so two more points and to kind of re-emphasize that a few really important ideas to throughout. First is I really like your a statement about the caveat, like you acknowledge the term usually when we think of it, we think of something that is very different from Olin Smith mentioning here. I think this applies to both energy and the knowledge, though both terms that are in his systems that are inclusive. For instance, like a flow of energy, that could be the energy in the physical sense, like the temperature of the mammal body is like higher than its environment in most of the time. That kind of heat type of energy, and then the energy can also be like transformed into like fat and stored in body. It's also considered knowledge. So there are different transformation, translation involved. But however, energy is like the catch-all phrase to refer to this like system because there are certain value attached to fat that it must make a thermodynamic sense for the production of fat in animal bodies, for instance. And the same applies to knowledge. To add some more specificity to what you said, is there are two things or not usually we tend to think together with knowledge are not present here. First, it's like it's not intentional. Second, it's not self-conscious. It could be, for instance, the beaver. It's not just a beaver, of course, because a sentient being knows how to build a dam to manipulate the flow of water to save energy, for instance, for the sake of argument. But this is also for it to survive, he also needs to know how to digest food. In a sense, it's not like chewing that kind of digestion, but his like stomach knows how to use certain parameter to filter in nutritious ingredients that are integrated into their body and that like excrete things that are toxic or things of that kind. Much is done at a much lower level without like centralized coordinating apparatus. We may say it as a brain or the mind, but the knowledge here is a way more inclusive. It's like information exchange at that level. Another thing I want to emphasize here is both for life to exist, there are mechanisms of managing the bioenergetics and the mechanism of managing bioinformatics. Both systems need to work and make sense at all time. There's not a single moment that it could be taken out. That's why we can't go into details here, but like it's important to emphasize for Odling Smee, he's saying to understand evolution of life, we must also your theory of life, evolution of life must kind of be compatible with the theory of a region of life. Because the moment when life starts, it must sustain all three parameters. You put it on the slide here that it needs to make the bioenergetic sense, it needs to make it the bioinformatic sense, and the capacities in both management need to be transmitted, have it need to be possible to transmit it to the next generation in the future. So those are the two things I want to highlight, given what you said.
Yes, and I think like both of these points get connected to like the basically like a kind of a maybe a fundamental question here that Odling Smee uses specific language to talk about it, but like he talks about it as RP and RI. But the interesting thing is that if this is correct, and life is dependent on a subtle flow of energy and matter, and structural and functional adaptive know-how, RP and RI, right? Which means, as Trent was mentioning, that like we need to understand these terms in very, very inclusive ways, right? Like information could be something very, very basic. Um, how do we distinguish relevant information from like mere matter, right? Let's put it crudely. What is information, right? Especially from like a materialistic perspective, and especially at a level that we cannot think about information in any sort of, descriptive judgments spoken in a like a human language, right? Like if we look at the world and from a materialist perspective, there's just matter, and we have matter like in different kind of composition of matter, and like putting like different types of chemicals being together in a certain like coordination. That seems to be the material condition that exists, material configuration of the world. Where the hell is information? Like, is information something you can point at? Like, information is non-material. Information is like some form of a, just invisible entity that like exists. Is it embedded in matter? Is it like information in general? Is information for a specific entity? Like, what is information? And what is information in general, and what is information insofar as this kind of adaptive know-how or like kind of a functional adaptive know-how is concerned, right? And that's exactly the two layers that we want to talk about. Again, uh, Odling Smee talks about a lot of different thinkers, but I think one of the major figures that he discussed is Claude Shannon and Shannonian information. And I think the basic point of mentioning that is to kind of get to the core of what information is about, and then showing how that basic core needs a couple of add-ons to make sense of the adaptive know-how or adaptive knowledge required for biological analysis. And the rest of this episode is going to be on Shannon and what Shannon means by information and how he thinks information could exist without any reference to meaning or intention or purpose in it, in any sort of radical way, and how Odling and Smee thinks data structure is correct for all inheritance systems of information in nature as well, with a caveat that the organisms that we are dealing with have some sort of an internal purpose. So we're going to talk about that later on. But Shannon first. And before Shannon, Trent.
Before Shannon. No, you did a great job to summarizing. If anything, we just want to perhaps highlight that for the energy, so energy and information are two concepts that Alan Smee made necessary for any discussion of the evolution of life. But that he is not willing to give a firm opinion about the relationship between the two categories, the energy and life. He just like makes the honest that physicists or different scientists that have not yet come to a conclusion on how the two relate. Yet that he thinks that both concepts are necessary for the understanding of life. So both terms are inclusive terms and more like postulates that here. He perhaps invites other thinkers to further nuance and develop. And I think the model he provides is also receptive to new theories or new paradigms in this two. But the main point is that he says we cannot think about evolutionary biology without considering whether life makes both energy and information sense. Yes.
Yes, exactly. Um, and I think it is interesting to ask this question as we are like dealing with his engagement with Shannon, that whether an update in information theory and relationship between information and energy radically changes Outling Smee's final conclusion of like niche construction, or how dependent it is
Mhm.
to the Shannonian information as kind of like a basis of understanding information. Anyhow, Claude Shannon, 20th century American polymath that was both a mathematician, electrical engineer, computer scientist, cryptographer, and often is called the father of information theory. And the conversation we're going to have on him, of course, is not going to cover all the nuances of his approach to the concept of information. And again, as we did with like the concept of life and laws of thermodynamics, this is all like we want to give you the basis to understand the kind of conversation we're going to have later on, and we want to understand what we want to get from um, these theories as it is relevant to our project. Now, what does Shannon want to do? One of the major things that is happening with Shannon is that he wants to kind of abstract from information in the human sense and get to the point of talking about information as something that is not about semantics, right? That is kind of the major counterintuitive point about Shannon's understanding of information, which it excludes meaning. For Shannon, the point whether a signal has a meaning or not in a strong human sense of the word, a strong symbolic uh, version of the concept, is its own thing, it's its own kind of a problem. There is something about information that is far more basic than that. So when Shannon wants to talk about information, he wants to talk about some sort of a quantitative metric for information that, to a degree, could be used for a gibberish message. It could be used for DNAs, and it could be used for like human like poems, right? Like something that like a scale, right? When you put a scale, you can put a human being on a scale. It could be potatoes on a scale. You can put like a leaf on a scale, right? And you get like a universal measure for weight. Something similar is happening with Shannon and information. Like to say that there is a scale for information is not to say that different forms of information are all equal. It just says that there is a scale, right? Just like saying that like a bag of potatoes could have the same weight as a human being is not to say that the bag of potato equals the human being. It just means in so far as that layer goes, they're equal. Now, the way that Shannon thinks of information is the language he uses is the language of uncertainty. Right? The more uncertainty, the more information is required to specify an outcome of a system. You can say that if there is more uncertainty, there is more information, right? And we can think about this as the exact opposite. If there is no uncertainty, the position of absolute predictability, 100% certain predictability, there is no information. And this is definitely not how Shannon talks about it, but just kind of like give a kind of a more concrete like version of this story, how this could be also in some ways intuitively right, is that when I know exactly what to do, I have exhausted all the information needed to do the job. Information has gone through zero. It is just me getting what I want. It is the absolutely predictable. There's nothing to be learned from that process. I don't need to spend extra energy to know how to go about what I want to go about. Right? Like you might need to play, you might, not you might, you must learn how to play the violin. And playing the violin has a lot of uncertainties of what position reaches what and what is the way like the coordination of the motor skills and like sight reading, all of that. Now in as someone is learning to play the violin, there's a lot of uncertainty, and as they become a master of the violin, all of those uncertainties go down. Now the point is not that suddenly you don't need to spend any energy to play the violin, but you don't need to spend energy to know how to play the violin. In that sense, the energy needed for the information is exhausted because playing the violin has become a fully predictable task. That's, I think, how like the kind of a more intuitive version of this story of why information and uncertainty are kind of intertwined. The more uncertainty, the more information is embedded in that system, or the more information is required to specify its outcome, right? As Shannon wants to measure information in bits, wants to measure information in quantitative scales, he introduces a term called bits to really tell us like how much information, right? Now, if you're associating information with degree of uncertainty, and we want to measure information in bits, basically bits is measuring uncertainty. There's nothing more to it. Again, if we there is no uncertainty, everything is certain, we go to zero. Like the equation goes to zero because there is no information. There is no need for information, quote unquote. Okay. But how do you measure like uncertainty? Like, how do you say whether this system versus another system, which one of them is more uncertain, right? And of course, this is something um, that gets sophisticated if you are looking for like a system that, wants to predict elections, right? But the logic, according to Shannon, remains the same as a very simple like dice game, right? And the basic kind of logic in the formulaic way of it is going to be about probability. But we can think about it in a different way that makes it easier for our purposes. If you want to know how much uncertainty exists in a system, ask yourself how many yes or no questions you need to ask to determine the outcome. Okay? What is the minimum number of yes or no questions you need to ask to know what the outcome is? Now, if I have a die that has four numbers on it, and it's a fair die, so a probability of all numbers are the same, and like I want to roll the die and like there's going to be a number, okay? Um, I want to know how much uncertainty exists in this die. Like, of course, if this die only had number one on every side of it, was zero uncertainty, zero information. The outcome was already known, right? The outcome is not known. How much it is unknown? Like we can ask it that way. Well, it is unknown in the sense that I need at least to answer two questions to know what the die is or what the roll was. If we have the die, Trent rolls it, I haven't seen what number has come. I can get to the number by two questions. Is it one or two? Is it either one or two? The answer is either yes or no. If it's yes, I can ask, is it one? And either it's yes or no, and ultimately doesn't matter. I have reached the answer. Or it is not one and two, then I say, is it three? And again, with that answer, I will have my final answer. I know the outcome. So because there are two binary questions that got me to the answer, that's just the bits that exist as information in the system. Okay. One other kind of a nuance that also is going to be important in our conversations, and then I will leave it to Trent to add anything he thinks is useful here, is that another way to kind of think about this is to think about it as memory, like in a form of memory, right? The more uncertain a calculation, more memory is needed to kind of you need to know the answer to the first question, then you need to know the answer to the second question. But what if I needed like 50 questions to get to the outcome? Well, you better like remember like each answer. Like you determining the final outcome requires you knowing the answer to all of those binary questions, right? So memory, energy that is needed to retain that memory, and information are all intertwined because Shannonian information is ultimately about degree of uncertainty. Trent?
Yes, 3 points in response to the three things that you led us through, which is really impressive. First is Just like energy for thermodynamics, it is a totalizing category. I want to use this word because it's like a category or a unit of measurement that is valid at a different stage of that energy composition. It could be in the stage of storage, could be the case of transmission, could be the case of like application or expression. So we can use energy to measure how a beaver says how much fat or energy they manage to store in their belly. Can measure it by energy. Uh, Transition how much energy they derived from the food that they imparted. And finally, how much energy is like used in like building a dam. So energy is like total like, unit there. And similarly, information is the same. Like the information, for instance, in Shannonians, the notion that bits measurement could be used to measure how information is stored, is obtained, transmitted, and eventually applied and expressed. Second thing is you already made it very clear. I just want to kind of have, because it is oral communication, listeners might have missed the very important detail here is Shannon is not just the father of information theory, but also the father of communication theory. And so that correlation between uncertainty as well as information is always mediated with like transmitter and recipient, that the dialogic the system. So it's important to understand the roller dice. That's a great example for four outcomes. That information is always about the outcome is that it depends upon the specific goal of that specific system. So we will be better served not to um, to say downplay the importance or centrality of this two concepts, so the goal and as well as the system in building up this correlation between uncertainty as well as the outcome. Outcome is specific to the goal, and uncertainty is specific to the state of the system. The final thing I want to mention is I really love the point you mentioned about memory. And memory in both Odling and Smee's writing as well as the other stuff we might draw a comparison of means very different things in different contexts. For instance, when you're talking about, say, that roll of dice, you need at least to remember what happened in your first question for the specifying or the outcome to be possible. So we need to remember both answers to both questions for an valid inquiry to be made. So the whole thing is about information, for lack of a better term, production. But memory also is used in the information storage and retrieval application sense, which is slightly different from what we just talked about. However, since information is a totalizing unit, the production storage as well as the application expression of it, we could create, according to Alan Smee or certain information theorists, a unifying set of vocabulary, such as memory, to connect and compare these processes at different levels. So memory works both in information outcome verification as well as the information storage and later on application. So those are my three kind of recapitulations of a lot of the points we made in the past 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, I think this is very interesting in terms of the point about like the transmission part, the communication part, and that is going to become something important in Shannon and also like in like some important layers of Odling Smee, which is the point that like if you're thinking about information as something that requires some sort of retrieval, um, there has to be kind of a consistency of transmission, of like understanding that this is the same type. This was the first question on this chain. This is the second question on that chain. This is a third question on that chain, right? And what is the quote unquote meaning of each step, right? But the cold beauty of all of these points that Shannon is trying to make is that a lot of times we're thinking about information, transmission, communication, expression of that information, learning, and these types of concepts. We are kind of tied up to the human version of this story, right? Which is all like semantics and like a very complicated, neural system in the brain and circuits and things of that nature. And the experiments that Shannon puts forward um, kind of cast doubt on the necessity of any of those semantic um, jargon to understand information, memory, communication, and even adaptation. Um, and for the remainder of this episode, we're just going to talk about what this experiment or what this system that Shannon created really was about, and what we can really like learn from that in terms of like the kind of a basic bone of information. All right, so Shannon created an electromechanical machine and a maze, and the machine that he created, which he called Theseus, um, is or what was like a mouse, like a machine mouse, and there was a maze, and in this maze there are a couple of things to kind of like clarify about like what this is about. Ultimately, like the kind of the success, the quote unquote success of the mechanical rat was to kind of get out of the maze and kind of find the endpoint, right? So there was a goal in place. Of course, the goal was not inside the machine. The machine didn't have any conception of a goal. The goal was external. The goal was Shannon's. In terms of the structure of the maze and the machine, this robotic mouse Theseus would has like had a motor, just a normal motor that could go forward and reverse, and that was kind of pretty much about it. And there was junctures, six junctures in this specific kind of experiment that the mouse would hit, and each time it would hit it, um, each juncture had a relay with a default position. So the mouse would go with this kind of a little motor that was attached to it, would hit the first juncture. The default was to turn left. Okay. If it turned left, two things happened. One, the relay would switch to right. Like it wasn't like it wouldn't be the same as it was before. And then when the mouse would go and let's say the left turn would make it to hit a wall, the wall had a specific kind of electric system that would make the mouse to reverse. So hit the wall, reverse engine, coming back to the juncture that is now set in the opposite direction, right? Which is right in this case. Then you would go, there is right, and the same kind of a process happens. So each time when the relay sends the mouse to the wrong position, the relay changes, the mouse reverses, and the relay gets set on the correct direction, right? So by the first time that the mouse goes through these junctures, it has quote unquote identified all the walls and switched all the relays to take it to the right position, right? So that every juncture had a default, but with this kind of a mini trial and error, Now all the relays has been switched to the right direction, the right meaning the correct direction, so that if we now put the mouse at the beginning of the maze again and like leave it, it will find its way because now the maze has like the system of the maze has changed. Now there are no number of things here in this like story that like a lot of things could change about this. For instance, in this case, it is not the like an internal mechanism in the robot that will change and say, I turned left while I had to turn right. It is the maze that changes. But that is like a secondary point. Like we can easily imagine the same system that the mouse has a system within itself that at every turn left. If you hit the wall, reverse, go the other way, and remember that, a memory, and then that would have the exact same consequence. Okay, so why is this important? Like, what is this? There are a number of interesting things about this story. First of all, the robot mouse, Theseus, is not a living entity, does not have nervous system, does not have any internal purpose, it doesn't have any intentionality, it does not have even like a, sophisticated processor. Um, and still, we can say that the robotic mouse learned something through this process. Okay. So this is first of all like kind of one of the beginning movements of like artificial intelligence, right? This is some form of learning that doesn't have any sort of internal like organ for knowledge or intention for survival or anything like that. Okay. So that's one layer that is important here. The second layer is that this is again about information, right? This is a system with a certain type of uncertainty. Like at each juncture, you don't know. It's a binary. Like with asking one question, you will solve that, right? So because there are six junctures in this system, this is six-bit information system. Which again, if we want to think about it in terms of energy, this is or and memory, this is this requires more energy to solve. This is a more uncertain system than the same maze with one juncture, right? So information here is solving that question. Information is reducing that uncertainty. And what is happening in this robotic mouse is that it progressively reduces the uncertainty in the system or in its relationship with the system, acquires the knowledge, the information, abolishes uncertainty, and then afterwards the system becomes a zero-bit system. There is no information that is needed. Okay. Theseus learned to go about the maze by this very basic trial and error system. And to learn to go about this maze, it needed energy and it needed a form of memory, which in the original experiment, it was embedded in the maze, but we could easily see that happening as like a working memory in the mouse itself. And this can be analyzed in terms of information. Maze is a classic case of uncertainty. Here is how you learn to reduce that uncertainty, gain the information, solve the puzzle, spend enough energy, get out of the maze. Now, you can, of course, now think about this as like a basic, basic story of adaptation, too, right? Not in any sort of biological sophisticated way, but if externally we think of this system as like, if the mouse had to get to the center to get a piece of cheese, right? The mouse that would solve that problem with spending the least amount of energy would have the competitive advantage. That mouse would be like the mouse that is adapted to the system, right? That would get what it wants from the system. It is fit for that environment. And the Theseus entering the maze did not know anything, was sort of unfit to get to the final point, but it slowly learned and enhanced its fitness within this very simple system. All of this is going to be important in our further conversations. Trent.
Well, nothing. You did a great job at summarizing this very amazing experiment. To maybe two side comments. The one is people in the past really knew how to name their experiment. This is a wonderful name. Not just because like it's sort of a Greek myth that sort of going through the maze of Daedalus to find the woman hidden by Minotaur. But also, if I remember correctly, if my childhood memory doesn't fail me, that just like the mouse here, the memory of how it worked was externalized outside the agent of the mouse, or in that case, the hero. He was using a kind of a thread, wool thread given to him by a woman so that after trial and error, that he was able to retrieve the pathway out, not because he remembered the route, but because he adapted the system or changed the
Mm.
system. Second thing is this is a really well selected case for Odling Smee's whole argument. Here, it's really the adaptive know-how is created and preserved through shaping the environment instead of really shaping the individual organism. We consider a mouse an organism here. So I think it's a wonderful selection of the case and a very memorable one. And it did a great job of summarizing, explaining what it is and how it's related to our whole discussion about life and information. Yes.
I think that this is like as I was trying to understand this experiment, I I had the same thought as you, and I was wondering why he doesn't like. It's very interesting that Odling Smee doesn't emphasize this point because
Mm.
something that is very interesting in the original version of this experiment is that the mouse doesn't change. The environment changes. But there is something very interesting that happens. Like if we add a new mouse, like take away Theseus
Mm,
and like, uh, add Zeus, like then with the exact same structure,
right,
Zeus now finds a way as well because the environment has changed.
right.
And this, in fact, is going to be something that is very much on par with what Alding Smee is talking about and Trent rightfully mentioned. Now, the question of this kind of like second phase of this life energy information relationship is how much of this whole Shannonian image of information is applicable to adaptive know-how in the evolutionary sense. Is it just Shannonian information? That's the end of the story. Shannonian information has nothing to do with it. Like, how can we kind of connect these two, especially with this kind of whole story of information, transmission, communication, memory, and execution, like all these kind of layers that exist in Theseus and Shannon's information theory. Our question is, like, according to Odling Smee, how much of this is applicable to evolutionary story and the evolution of life? Trent?
Well, nothing else to add. Just dear listeners, to stay attuned. Next episode, we're gonna unpack this question.